what you tested on and what's the exam going to look like for your GCSE French reading. Looking at the AQA specification, that's the exam board that we're using, there's a section which is just at a glance. So here is in summary what the reading is about. Not really rocket science. You're going to understand language and respond to it, importantly to different types of written language. You'll have a written exam. If you're doing the foundation, it'll be 45 minutes and the higher it'll be an hour. It contributes 60 marks. Each of the skills is either 60 or rounded up to 60, and then that becomes 25% of your GCSE. What are the questions going to be like? Well, at both foundation tier and higher tier, you've got 3 sections. First section, questions in English, and you answer in English, or non-verbally, that means you tick a picture. B, questions in French to be answered in French or non-verbally. So that's probably that tends to be the most demanding one, where you've got to actually understand the question, not only the text but also the question. And then section C, they test your reading by giving you some French, which you have to translate from French into English. And they're minimum of 35 words for foundation, minimum of 50 words for higher tier. So let's look at that in a bit more detail. So the texts then, they can be shorter and longer written texts. Sometimes the more complex language comes later on in the test. So obviously you've got to be able to understand the overall message normally. It could be key points, could be details and opinions. And the sorts of things could be instructions like this, public notice. Pretty important to understand a notice like that, isn't it? And then it could be adverts. Also longer things like things out of brochures or or guides. It could be letters. But also they particularly say that they have to have some literary texts. And the first question that you're going to be doing in Module 4 is to do with a literary text, Le Petit Prince. For higher level, it'll be particularly past, present and future events, actually for the foundation as well. And the items, it says, will include authentic sources. So a lot of them will be authentic like that, but sometimes they will have to adapt them and abridge them to make sure that it's not too demanding. And then as far as the literary texts which are concerned, here's one here. It could include contemporary and historical sources. So that's what you're going to be reading. How do you respond? Well, as well as understanding what it means, it also has this word deduce. So they're not necessarily expecting you to understand every single word that's there, but they're hoping that from what you know already, you can deduce the meaning. So there will be some unfamiliar language, but normally the root of a particular word you'll have learnt in some other way. So you might have learnt the noun, but you don't know the verb that goes with it. So certainly the idea is, can you work out what things are? You'll get longer texts as well, and you might have to scan through for particular information. Again, you're not expected to understand everything. This is really important, but you're looking for relevant details. So again, this idea, not only are you deducing meaning from words you don't know, but even if you understand it, sometimes it'll be at a higher level of inference, getting the inference and the implicit meaning. You'll have come across this with doing your GCSE English, that sometimes it's not just understanding the words, it's understanding what was in the author's mind, what impact did they want to have on the reader. So it's the same sort of thing that you might have to do, particularly at a higher level. What do they look like? Well, here's an example. This was given to us in 2016, ready for the first testing. So that's a specimen. That's just what it looks like there. So this is higher, looking at a higher level, 1 hour. So here we are. You know there are 3 sections. Here's the section A, where you'll have a text. So there's an example of something from a newspaper. By the way, this number 1 on the higher level is the overlap with the foundation level. So everybody would get something that looks like this. So it's a fairly long text there. But there, you look at it and all you've got to do is to write in a percentage. So you're working out what that means and working out what percentage goes there. So that's a multi-choice, but also there might be open-ended ones, which is the least popular reason, so you've got to write that in English. Section B, if you remember, that's where everything's in French. So it starts with lisez, so read the email, qui parle de ses projets scolaires, which is talking about the school projects. Not plans, sorry. It's not too difficult normally to understand that bit. But the questions themselves will be in French. So we've got to get you used to being able to read questions in French and answer them. This example here is an open-ended one, a question with you have got to produce the French. But there are also quite a few multi-choice ones, which could be either words or it could be symbols that you're ticking. And then for the section C, obviously you test your reading also as to, well, if you read something, could you put it into English? And all of the ones that we've had from the sample onwards have normally been marked out of 9, and there'll be 9 chunks there that you've got to be able to translate. So you're not getting a mark for every single word you do. You've got to be able to get the sense of each bit. And this is where it's quite demanding sometimes, because sometimes there could be just a little word in there. You might have understood the overall sense of it, but if you miss out a particular word like today or yesterday, you wouldn't get the mark. So it's ever so important to know as many words as you can for that. But it is just 9 marks out of a total of 60. Every year the exam board really helpfully puts out advice to teachers and to students about how to approach the exam, particularly based on their experience of marking from the previous year. So here's some advice which came out in January 2020. A lot of these things will seem very obvious. They're things which you do when you're doing English. I know when you're doing your English GCSE, you've got to be very clear about how to tackle a reading comprehension. One thing is make sure that you really read the introduction to the question. So in French, normally there is an introduction which says something like, the children are talking about their plans for after school, or the family's talking about what they did on their holiday. So that'll give you a context. That's important. Do answer every question, especially if it's a multi-choice where you've just got to write A, B, C or D. You can't lose out. They're not going to give you any negative marking. So if in doubt, have a guess. And also be aware that there are peaks and troughs. That means that sometimes, something will be very difficult, but the next one will be less difficult. And the next one will be a bit more difficult and then less difficult. So don't give up. Do read the whole of the sentence. Sometimes you think you've got the answer by just reading the beginning of it, but you've got to read to the end because there might be something which contradicts it or which adds to it. Typically, there's where people get caught out is sometimes where they'll say, is somebody expressing a positive or a negative or a positive and negative view about a particular subject? They may start by saying that they really like something and people might think, oh, that's positive, and go on to the next one. Do carry on, because you could carry on in the text and then find they say, but sometimes I'm not so happy with a particular aspect, in which case the answer is going to be P and N. So don't get caught out by seeing what's at the very start of it. Always read on. And in particular, every year they will say that it's negatives which catch people out, that they might see the verb and think, oh, they like it, and they just have missed out the ne pas, which means not. I don't like it. Another bit of advice is that if you've got a question, don't just copy out a whole chunk of the text thinking, oh, the answer might be in there. There might be a bit of it that's right, but there might be a bit of it which is wrong. And if there's anything which is wrong, obviously they're just not going to accept it. So be very careful about which bits very, very occasionally you can lift it from the text, but that's quite rare. Normally you've got to adapt it somehow. If you're told to give one reason or one detail about something, only give one. If you gave 2 and one of them is right and one of them is wrong, you're not going to get the answer, the mark. So that's really important. This is a paper which takes 60 marks. Remember that there were 9 for the translation. Do make sure you leave enough time for that. It's at the end of the exam, so there's a danger that people might rush that bit. I've even heard of some people who've decided that they'll just start with the translation and do that first of all, and then go back to the rest of it. So do manage your time across those sections. And be aware that as far as the translation goes, it isn't necessarily the hardest thing, because it covers, the parts of the translation are going to be actually easier than some of A and B. And the last bit of advice, or really instruction, is it tells you that you've got to answer in French. Section B, make sure that you do answer in French. It could even be that when you get the examination paper, you really highlight that bit, or you ring it round and you say, yes, I know that I've got to do that.